Hello and welcome to New Kinship. If you haven't joined before, my name is David Frank and my co-host is TJ Espinoza.
Hello, everyone.
And we have joining us here today a returned guest and friend, Joel Carini. Welcome, Joel. Thanks for joining again.
Thank you, David and TJ, for having me.
And Joel also has his own podcast called The Natural Theologian and a lot of writings on Substack as well. So definitely encourage you to go check those out. It's been, fun to dialogue. We met when Revoice was in St. Louis. We got to...
So 2 years ago, is that right? Yeah.
3? 2?
It's already been 2.
Yes, 2.
Okay. And it's been really fun. Joel comes from similar backgrounds as me in the Presbyterian tradition and Reformed thinking, and has come into the Side B conversation space, but from a less intrinsically personal perspective, as coming from a straight perspective. But you've been very theologically and philosophically passionate in it, and we just wanted to hear more about why that's been. I think that's kind of the gist of this episode, is just to hear what have been all the different threads that have tied together for you as a theologian and philosopher in that. TJ?
May I add something? I also have to say it's interesting as well because, Joel, you have been one of the few kind of public thinkers who have been sympathetic to Side B and actually pursued sort of the sympathy or the reflection in a systematic way, or you keep thinking, reflecting, adding more to the conversation. Because we have people who are straight, who are sympathetic to Side B, but they don't write much or don't think much about it. They're just sympathetic. And then we have critics who sometimes write more, but they're just intrinsically unsympathetic. I don't know about intrinsically. Anyways, but they're unsympathetic for some reason. So it's interesting. You occupy an unusual space that's not unique, but rare, at least in the current kind of discussion. So so you're welcome.
Hey, that's the space I was trying to occupy. I appreciate it.
Can you share which kind of led first for you in trying to have, enter into this dialogue? Did it start out in a kind of personal, sympathy side of things, or was it more of an intellectual curiosity and you saw maybe things that you didn't agree with that other people were stating on the interwebs?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be the personal side. That eventually raised kind of the intellectual question. But, as I think I mentioned on our first interview, my experience at Wheaton College was very formative, around, I started 2010, I feel like it was the fall semester that Wesley Hill spoke in chapel. And, one of the first fellow students I met at Wheaton was my suite mate, who was himself gay, and just getting to have some of those conversations, and those conversations being very alive on the Wheaton campus right around then, with a lot of folks wanting to kind of correct the kind of fundamentalist tendencies of evangelicalism, especially on this question, and to open up more space for people to be open about their, let's say, minority sexuality. That was an open conversation. So that put me obviously in kind of personal sympathy with friends that I was discussing with, and, people whose story I was hearing, reading Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting. I really think it started there. And that didn't, immediately make me, Side B in my ideas. That started a gradual process that I think had a trajectory toward that, but, didn't automatically get me there. If I think about the positions I held since then, I think I didn't hold side X anymore. I'll say that, but I definitely held the kind of side Y, that you shouldn't identify as gay for, some of the reasons that people currently spell out. But that was alongside my kind of sympathy and interest
Mm-hmm.
in the issue and the people. So, while I was then at seminary, I went from Wheaton to Westminster Seminary, my wife and I were interested in serving at Harvest USA, which, they have a reputation as more in the side Y perspective. But my motivation was, this is something I care about. I could have been side Y, but just not get involved.
Yeah.
But I was interested in the issue because I was concerned about people for whom living the Christian life might be harder for that reason. And that's kind of the angle I was probably coming from. But eventually that kind of raised questions as I heard the theological debates. And I would basically hear a denial that, trying to think what I heard in this one seminary class, it seemed to be a failure to really recognize that, like, this might be a stable feature of someone's personality, that they are attracted to the same sex. I call that sexual orientation now. Like, I think most people do.
Yeah.
But even before I adopted that language, I had the sense that, like, if that's really a stable feature of somebody and their experience of the world, like, we've got to take that pretty seriously. And while I didn't quite know how to articulate that, the side Y things I heard in, say, the classroom or in church or online discussions didn't feel to me like they recognized that fully enough. They weren't saying, oh, it's easy, go through this system of counseling and you'll change your orientation. But by focusing on the language and saying, don't speak about it this way, or it'll come to me exactly kind of how it was being put. I think it was more the point about, is the attraction itself sin? That was the discussion that kind of got to me, where I'm like, well, no matter what you want to say, the fact that somebody's attractions or desires are in the opposite direction intrinsically is not something someone chose, did, or really that fits in the category of sin very easily at all. That's just the hand of cards you were dealt. Whether you commit a sin or do the right thing depends on how you play the cards.
Yeah.
So that personal sympathy eventually, as I kind of listened to theological debates over a decade, really pushed me to eventually say, I'm on board with the side B folks. And if I had any questions left when I started writing about the matter online, I came across you guys, I got to go to Revoice, and I kind of confirmed, this is not, dangerous, slippery slope stuff. This is really good, supporting people in their Christian walk.
I wanted to ask you about your experience at Wheaton College. When you were there, were there people that we would call side B or proto side B that you were engaging, like your gay people in your life? Or were they in a different position at that point?
I think it was definitely proto side B. That's a good way to put it. I mean, the conversations even then, from what I understand, were still just gestating and like spiritual friendship blogs and stuff like that. And, Wesley Hill, hearing his story, that was very foundational and influential. Over the next 4 years, Christopher Yuan also spoke at chapel. Rosario Butterfield also spoke at chapel, which I think shows the breadth of, maybe Phil Rikens, like what voices he wanted to sort of have in the mix, was all of that. He didn't choose one way or another. And I don't know if it was all him either, but that range was within what I was hearing about. But then, the big thing I remember at Wheaton was just like wanting people to be able to come out in the sense of even being vulnerable. Obviously, in other matters, you got these like lust-free living groups and like how to not look at porn for straight guys. There's all that kind of emphasis on confessing sin, living vulnerably and openly, which I think really ought to dovetail with an openness to people who have a different experience. It doesn't always, but that vulnerability, I think, ought to extend. And that's what I was seeing at Wheaton. So I think implicitly that heads in a side B direction, just because, you know, you're speaking about kind of openness coming out, that vulnerability, you know.
At that point, how were the language politics, or how there people engaging language? Or you were there at this Christian college, were people using gay terms, or were they using SSA or something else? Or not terms, no terms? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I just didn't see any battle lines yet.
Oh, okay.
At that time. The first time I saw battle lines, I think I had already graduated, but Rosaria Butterfield spoke on campus,
Mhm.
and there was basically a protest
Yeah.
with the slogan, "Not a single story."
Okay, yeah.
And just to reveal where I was at the time, I was kind of put off by this. Like, oh, this felt like, you know, I read her book. This is great. She's converted to Christ, you know.
And my understanding at that time was that it was the fact that she got married and that they were, I think, reading into that kind of a conversion therapy or like this is what, you know, gays or lesbians, their righteous path is. And I don't remember her making strong stances on language at that time.
Right. See, that's the interesting thing, is at that time she was not making strong stances, though she was married and had had children and was, from what I believe, a homeschool mother. So that kind of, I think that has become more the reason why it's not a single story, is like her story is just too, you know, movie plot from the
Sure.
lesbian gender studies professor to the homeschool mom of money. But at that time, she wasn't making like a point of that. Whereas her current positions, I think I so much more understand now the kind of protester's perspective.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, yeah, now it is kind of like, here's the normative path. Even if she wasn't ex-gay, here's a kind of normative or ideal path. Whereas like, it's very much not a single story. What, you know, we need like Wes Hill's story of, you know, no mixed orientation marriage on the horizon, and many other stories, just to see the possibilities for life that are available to the celibate or chaste gay Christian.
Also, you guys are both pointing to this, but back then the schools of thought had not hardened yet or emerged so much. So Wesley Hill and Rosaria Butterfield were in the same realm back at, you know, I don't know how many years ago that was, like 20 years ago, maybe almost. But yeah, they were kind of in the same realm of things. And Christopher Yuan as well. But then subsequently, the schools of thought hardened and developed like a decade later into now. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think back then, I think that they like I remember, you know, seeing those things and being uncomfortable with Wesley Hill's use of gay terminology. So it's not that the sentiments, the, you know, disagreements weren't there, but it felt, yeah, people might express those opinions without, the hesitancies were there, but battle lines have been drawn now. Go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, they totally have been drawn. And I mean, when someone writes the history of this particular discourse and conversation in the future, they'll have to reckon with this reality that, yeah, like most social movements, over time, things develop and things harden, sometimes soften. But it's this historical process of developing discourse. Something else I was going to ask you, Joel, when you saw that more than one story sort of protest, like looking back in retrospect, do you think they were side A in like proto side A and what we now call side A? Is that kind of what that vibe of that particular protest? Or were they actually more mixed, like just Rosaria Butterfield, there's more than one story and it could be side B, side A, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, at the time, I think this just shows you how people's perceptions work.
Yeah.
I perceived it as basically a side A protest.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was accurate.
interesting.
My guess is that it would have been
Okay.
mixed.
Yeah.
You know, I wasn't familiar with what was going on, and I knew there was some sort of kind of support club or group for same-sex attracted Christians by that time at Wheaton, which had its own history thereafter. But my guess would be that it was more as a supported group at Wheaton. I'm guessing it was primarily side B, but if anyone was leaning side A, they probably would have been there too.
Yeah.
So my perception was a bit strong as someone who thought of Rosaria as like, oh, that's just kind of a normal, you know, story of a gay person turned Christian. And I think my perception was probably too narrow at the time. Again, all those battle lines have now been drawn more clearly. And now I see that emphasis on it's not just a single story is something that both side B and side A could equally emphasize. Even someone side Y could emphasize that.
As someone who was, I think, pretty deep in side Y culture and thought, what would be your best articulation for why Christians would want to take certain clear stances, potentially even around the idea of sexual orientation? How would you have best articulated that?
Yeah, I don't know if this will be the best. I'll start with some of the things that I thought at the time. So, man, this is kind of the philosophy of language. It's kind of what I do now in my PhD dissertation. But I thought to myself, okay, if someone tells you they're gay, okay, now you know that about them. And then, you know, next year they tell you, I'm getting married. What does your mind leap to? Are they marrying the same sex or the opposite sex? And I said, well, in America, you know, if you hear someone communicate both that they're gay and then that they're getting married or that they're married, your mind leaps to they are marrying somebody of the same sex. Therefore, gay, there's like a kind of conceptual, our concept of gay basically includes that if you are going to partner up, you're going to partner with the same sex. And so I thought that was like part of the very concept of being gay. And it's just basically observable in Americans' assumptions about if a gay person marries, that's who they will marry. That was kind of one example that kind of led me to think, I think gay is loaded with this connotation. Now I'm basically writing a dissertation against that idea of connotation. Like, I don't think that's true. Words don't have this extra baggage. I mean, or they don't have to. That's not part of the meaning. That's just part of, to get technical, what is pragmatically implicated in a certain culture. But you can have cultures where that's not the case. Say in kind of side B land, where the whole point is to counter the expectation. To say, I'm gay, but that doesn't mean that I'm sexually active with the same sex. It doesn't mean that if I marry, I will marry someone of the same sex. This is all wide open. So that was one argument I held. But I think the biggest argument I see has to do with the same-sex attraction language and the idea that concupiscence or original sin, just like desire and attraction and lust, these things are already sin before the action. You know, based on Jesus's words about lust, but also kind of a traditional Protestant or Augustinian theology of our desire, that sin kind of exists prior to action. Like that's Augustine's doctrine of original sin. Sin is already resident in us, or Calvin's that sin is already sort of awake and alive prior to us taking an action, or the passage in James about sin's kind of already conceived and eventually leads to action and then finally gives birth to death. I think if you just basically don't have the category of an orientation, and so you're just thinking, okay, you have some people with heterosexual attractions, those are sinful. You know, that's sinful. And you have some people with homosexual attractions. Those are also sinful. If that is your only category of sexual psychology, which is basically what this is, then I think most consistently you're going to be led to this kind of parity between heterosexual and homosexual desire as both kind of incipiently lust, unless they are within the context of marriage for your spouse. So if you watch this YouTube video where Kevin DeYoung and Tim Keller discuss the PCA's report on human sexuality, Kevin DeYoung's perceived as kind of more the right of the PCA, Tim Keller more the mid to left, but they're articulating the same exact position. And that's basically what they're articulating. To me, that basically lacks the category of orientation. Orientation is prior to your attractions. Orientation explains what attractions you will have. So if, you know, let's imagine this guy, Gus, who's raised by monks on a desert island and, you know, never has an experience of attraction in his life. You know, we could have maybe he's asexual, maybe he's heterosexual, you know, who knows? He's with these male monks and, you know, nothing's going on. Okay, well then one day this helicopter drops in and steals Gus away from the desert island, takes him to Berkeley, California, where they stuff him in a MRI machine and force feed him pornography. And they figure out what his sexual orientation is. They're like, oh, he's straight. He thought he was a sinless monk, but he's got, you know, he likes gals. It's like, okay. Which is basically how sexual psychology science is done. It's like, except for the force and the kidnapping. But it basically reveals which way would you swing. Well, what I want to say is Gus, when he was on that desert island, before he got, you know, kidnapped away by the sexual psychologists, he already had a sexual orientation. It was revealed through the process of the fMRI machine and the experimentation. But so the orientation is an underlying feature that's there when latent. Like it is true of me when I am asleep that if you wanted to turn me on, you're going to have to use this kind of stimulus and not that kind of stimulus. It's a fact about a person. It's prior to their attractions. It explains their attractions. Again, it's which hand of cards were you dealt? And that's prior to even, you know, which cards do you want to play? But that's what I've come to. So I think the strongest version of the side Y comes from thinking that basically attraction is the lowest level of sexual psychology and that it comes under kind of Christ's condemnation of lust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
that's helpful.
That is helpful. And it shows as people have tried to double down on their theological perspectives and be really consistent within them, the rejection of LGBTQ language has also led to actually a rejection of even SSA language. Of even if you put SSA as an adjective before Christian, you are still describing yourself within the bounds of this sinful sexual orientation framework. You are attaching yourself to these sinful desires in some way that's inconsistent. So it's been interesting to see the ways that people, I can praise them for their consistency, except the fact that I think the consistency is kind of leading to more, to me, like, I don't think it actually produces the fruits. And I've been trying to keep that. Jesus says, you know, how will you know if a tree is good or bad? Well, you tell by its fruits. And so to really be pressing on the fruits of what kind of cultures, what kind of discipleship it creates, where people are trapped in the specific ways that they can talk about it and kind of ends up being a reductionistic approach to, and even the distinguishment between like sinful lust experiences of desire and attraction and then orientation. Like I think there's actually a lot of, and yeah, a lot of differentiation that can happen there and nuancing. And it's interesting as I've looked into the Bible that translations are actually taking their best interpretive efforts to say, in this context, when they talk about desire, it has a negative connotation, and so we're going to translate it as lust. But in this context, it's not necessary, it's maybe neutral, maybe positive, so we're going to translate it as desire. But it's the same Greek word that is is bearing out in different ways. And so it's like, oh, the Bible in English, we've kind of connotated lust is bad, desire is good. But when we're trying to be like really biblicist, they don't actually at least clearly have that distinction with like a different word for different meanings. But it's just like, oh, when desire gets in this way that it bears the fruit of sin. But is it possible for desire to bear the fruit of life and not sin? Can the spirit work in it rather than our sinful flesh work through desire? And I guess that's something as I've been reapproaching those biblical passages to say, what is the nature of desire in a human person? And that it's not so maybe easy to, categorize.
Yeah. I mean, so I've got 2 academic papers I'm trying to write kind of on these subjects. The one is about sexual orientation. The second is about desire. And in both Jared Moore, the kind of new firebrand on these topics, and Denny Burke, who's been at it for at least a decade, like they both, in a certain way, try to distinguish categorically between good desire and bad desire. Like there's these good desires, they're good, and there's these bad desires, and they're bad. And they try to say, like, Christ, he only ever had the good desires. And so sure, he was tempted, but it was actually maybe only one of them even makes that distinction. So yeah, Christ is tempted, so he must have had some desire. So what was going on there? He was tempted to sin, so this is getting really sketchy. Well, he was only tempted by good desires, whereas we're tempted by good desires and these bad desires. And that's just contrary to like Christian theology of desire, going back to Augustine. Augustine, the Christian Platonist, is like, all desire is good because all desire is for the good, ultimately. But it gets brought astray. And unfortunately, for certain versions of theology, that means you cannot categorically distinguish between our temptations and Christ's temptations. They all come from our humanness, and they all twist it in some way, and that's all it is. So yeah, I think you're right. Like the attempt to kind of translate that out of the Bible, I think has a similar motivation. I'm similarly skeptical. I still want to dig into this one about the idea of sinful nature. Like that's often a translation of flesh, I think in kind of the NIV's tradition of translation. But I think the word is flesh, and I'm not sure that there's a thing called a sinful nature. It's our human nature, and post-fall, something has happened to it as a result of the curse and as a result of sin. And I think the question is really, in what way can we call the brokenness and twisting that of our nature that leads to sinful actions? In what way can we call that sin? And I think it's an open debate, but there's at least an argument to be made that Augustine and the tradition after him called it sin by, David gave me this word, metonymy, or like analogy. Like because our broken post-fall nature leads to sin, we call that disorder original sin. But really it's not sins yet. Those are actual sins. It's something prior. And I think that's actually a lot of the theological debate, is how do you understand that?
The nature of the corruptibility of our flesh And I've just been reading a lot of Westminster, so it talks about the corruption of our nature, which we call original sin, which precedes all actual transgressions. And so they're actually doing that distinguishing work between this original sin and the actual sins, the actual transgressions, which actualize in our life as we live out of the corruption of our nature. And I don't know where the verses, Bible references aren't my strong suit, but where it says like Jesus took on the form of sinful man, and there like he entered into our flesh, but it's like Jesus had all the same desires as us, but in Augustinian language, his desires didn't get disordered. He always loved God more than man. He always loved his father and mother in the proper way that they should be loved. But temptations are saying, maybe you should love yourself more than your neighbor. Maybe you should, love pleasure more than the love of justice. And so his desires are being tried and tugged upon, whereas our desires have already been disordered. And so we're in that mess of good desires all disordered. And I think similarly, like he's in a flesh that is corruptible. It's liable to pain and to death, to sin, to disordered temptations. Whereas we're in that constantly corruptible flesh. And it is really interesting looking at Paul's language of he's definitely implying this corruptibility, this we're in this flesh and it's constantly going which way. And I think that people translate it into sinful nature because they're trying to avoid like maybe a bad Platonism or Gnosticism that would think that, oh, the flesh is always bad. But then, yeah, what are we missing in that understanding? I think it's really more to be dug into.
Yeah. I mean, I think that might be the wrong way to go about it, as opposed to saying the flesh has potential to go in multiple directions. Like our flesh is definitely corrupted, but it's still with our body, with our flesh that we actually need to obey God. With our flesh, this body of death, as Paul calls it, we need to live by the Spirit. And we're going to do it imperfectly. But, the flesh is going to be with us until we are delivered from this body of death. Like Christian obedience is obedience of the imperfect, fallen human being this side of glory. But the thing you were just getting at, Colton Beach brought this to my attention recently, is like there's actually a Protestant debate about the doctrine of the peccability of Christ. From what I understand, there's not a Catholic debate. And Grant Hartley has kind of stood up for the Catholic, Christ was impeccable, and heck, Mary was too. Which, we as Protestant, I'm like, I think Mary was human like us for sure.
Before we go on, can you define that for our listeners before we go on?
Yeah,
Thanks.
sorry. It's just capable of sin.
Thank you.
So the debate is, could Christ have sinned? Was Christ capable of sin? Or is the reason he never sinned because he just couldn't? He was free from it because he's got a divine nature. But among recent theologians, actually R.C. Sproul held that Christ was impeccable. He could sin. It's just that he didn't by his will and his obedience to the Father. But by having sort of a weak, vulnerable human nature, he was capable of temptation and, in theory, capable of sin. And in some of those debates, I still think this is something to be explored and tested and figured out. But I'm interested in exploring ways that we can less carefully distinguish our nature from Christ's. Because Christ suffered in every way as we are, was tempted in every way, yet without sin. I think the question there is like, well, the without sin means he didn't have all these desires in him, right? It's like, no, I think Christ loved God with all his heart, soul, and mind, such that even if he experienced corrupted desires, even the corrupt desires that you or I experience, he would have obeyed God. Like that's, I think, the hope we need. I can't yet plant my flag on it theologically, but I think we need to be, I think it's a debate that can be had whether and to what extent we must, make sure, oh, Jesus never experienced some of these really bad desires. It's like,
And,
I'd like to believe that even if he did experience that, he would have obeyed God
yeah.
and that would have been good enough.
And it might even nuance corrupted desires versus desires to a corrupt end, where yeah, like what's in the desires? The desire is a desire for joy or goodness or connection, but it's unto a corrupt end that he could have experienced that good desire pushing him astray. The other interesting thing that in kind of thinking about Jesus's nature and fully God, fully man, I remember getting a little pushback at times, even just how Jesus did ministry of like, oh, he's God, he can just do all these things, but actually show this profound weakness where he does it by the power of the Holy Spirit. That I think he does ministry in the same way that he calls us to do it, not on our own strength, but by the power of the Spirit. So it's kind of a parallel discussion on just like the nature of Christ as it and how much that relates to our nature.
Absolutely. There's a lot to explore there. I mean, for example, like in the Reformation, the Reformed and the Lutheran kind of took different angles on this. Like the Lutherans basically thought, coming from something Luther said, that Christ's human nature was kind of deified. It was like kind of a superhuman nature because he was God. Whereas the Reformed were much more emphasizing, no, Christ is human.
Mm-hmm.
Like he really suffered as we suffered. And, the specific debate was like, Christ is not ubiquitous. Christ is Christ is not everywhere, like the divine nature is everywhere, which was the Lutheran way to express kind of Christ's physical presence everywhere, including in the Eucharist. The Reformed were like, no, Christ is finite. And you know what that means? When we celebrate the Lord's Supper, Jesus is not physically there. Why? Because he's a human. He can only be in one place at one time. And where is he right now? Right hand of the Father.
Interesting.
So I think the emphasis on Christ's real humanity is actually deep in the Reformed tradition, which is one reason why I still think, despite the Reformed tradition's recent efforts to go really anti-side B and all this stuff, I think there's a lot of resources there to have a greater emphasis on the commonality of our humanity with Christ and the weakness of our nature.
Interesting.
Can we, I think, hitting on this similar conversation, but at a different angle, part of, as I understand, you've been diving into side B thought, thinking around the philosophy of language, the theology of our nature, that some of these ways that people try to say, oh, well, you shouldn't understand your sexual orientation to be part of your like personality or something. And from kind of how have you seen this have that mode of thinking also hit other ways of a human experience, maybe in the counseling field?
Can I step in on this? Because I have something that's related to this for Joel. One of the things I like most about your work, your projects that I've seen you do, is that you want to engage, you call yourself the natural theologian, you want to engage the realm of what you call nature. A lot of these people who are the critics, especially in the Reformed field that I see, basically I find them to be biblicists, essentially. They just think the Bible is the only like firm epistemic ground to base like a way of thinking of the world on. And I know this is your jam.
Yes.
You're all about this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
So, but that seems to be the problem. Like when David Frank talks about these biblical definitions of desire, I'm like, yes, but there's also there's prior assumptions about what human nature is like from experience and empirical ways of understanding the world that people are taking to interpret the Bible, but also the biblical authors themselves were also using. And so it's to understand, it's like we need to meet different horizons of understanding to discern what it means to know and to follow God well. But that can't just incorporate the Bible. And I don't know why would Christians think it would they just be about the Bible only. But anyways, I know this is one of your things, so I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. Well, let me dig into all that together. And I think those two questions really fit together because the kind of Christian counseling world and Christian approaches to psychology is one of the biggest places where the like sources of our epistemic ground of knowledge, as you said, like really comes to the fore. So you've got almost an explicit debate between biblicists and integrationists within kind of counseling debates. On the one hand, they might not call themselves, some people call themselves biblicists. John Frame adopts the label. He's not a biblical counselor, but he's a theologian. There's probably some biblical counselors who do, but they've been really banging on the drum of the sufficiency of Scripture. Like you shouldn't need to know any secular psychology or counseling methods in order to counsel another Christian. And that is then debated by kind of the integrationists. And then there's people in between with different levels of integration, basically. But the integrationists say, look, we got to take information from the Bible because we do want to say distinctively Christian things and not, secular worldviews that people are, completely physically determined, or there's no moral dimension that really matters, or we can just affirm everything someone says about themselves without criticism. But we do need knowledge from outside the Bible because, we're outside the Bible. Like the way my mind works is not, exhaustively written down in Scripture. Mm-hmm. It's currently being studied by psychologists, scientifically for the last 150 years, but it's been studied for a lot longer than that. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right, TJ. Like, why do we think it's only going to come from the Bible? The Bible doesn't say that.
I know it doesn't.
Like,
yeah.
The Bible, like the book of Proverbs, from what I understand from like this Tremper Longman book, parts of it are available elsewhere. Like some of the Proverbs were not like specifically only for the Bible. Mm-hmm. They were worldly wisdom that was true and accurate, mm-hmm. and was therefore, as Solomon collated things from everywhere, it's included because, this all truth is God's truth. Yeah. But, Scripture affirms the natural law, it affirms natural revelation, all these types of things. But then to get to David's question, like I've seen so many parallels with other issues, especially through my wife's experience in Christian counseling and, even the biblical counseling movement. Recently, she's had a big emphasis on OCD in her counseling. Mm-hmm. You can actually find her speaking on a podcast of Anchored Virtual recently, where I think she really hits the nail on the head of like all the features of OCD that are kind of empirical and not explained in the Bible. And specifically the kind of religious OCD. A lot of people have been discussing religious scrupulosity.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where people are, really obsessed with some spiritual issue. It might be personal assurance of salvation. Mm-hmm. It might be, sometimes it's, am I homosexual? Mm-hmm. Did I have a thought? Maybe that means I'm homosexual, or some other kind of illicit sexual desire, mm-hmm. and so on. People get these worries, or they had an angry thought at someone. I'm a murderer because of what Jesus says. And they often spiritualize these mm-hmm. things. These people will read more theology than anybody. If they went to the average pastor seeking counsel, the pastor would be like, finally, somebody whose issue is theology, and I get to bring out all my theology books and teach them about assurance of salvation. Mm-hmm. It's like, no. As Anna's discovered in like the proper counseling approach to OCD is like, do not have that conversation the OCD person really wants mm-hmm. to have. You need to go the level below that mm-hmm. and say, the issue is something that empirical psychologists have discovered affects all people, religious and non-religious, mm-hmm. for about 5% of the population, or 10%. I forget the mm-hmm. details, but a disorder of kind of obsessing over these things and experiencing a lot of anxiety around certain things. And, the proper approach has been shown to be, from what I understand, kind of exposure therapy, mm-hmm. which for the person with religious OCD can include doing things they think are sacrilegious, mm-hmm. Which actually aren't, but kind of the point being, if you try to go the sufficiency of Scripture, mm-hmm. you're going to be obsessed with the theology issue. you're actually going to be contributing to that person's problem,
Yeah.
which is a particular form of suffering that they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
You can read a pastor who wrote A Quiet Mind to Suffer With about this experience of OCD. What they really need is kind of sympathy for the weakness, frailty, and brokenness of their nature, which needs to be combined with a willingness to empirically understand that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think if you really believe that the fall affected human nature, then you should be real into empirical psychology. Because empirical psychologists are studying what is up with our broken minds and
Mm-hmm.
psychology and nature.
Mm.
So that's one parallel.
Mm.
I think there's a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, for me, it might be something like anger. You know, different people have different levels of kind of proneness to anger. And, you know, when someone's angry, one response to them could be, you're so bad for being angry. But there are other possible responses. Like that might not be the best way to get someone to calm down with their anger. But I think a common Christian approach is to say to someone in that situation, like, you are being really bad. Stop it. And I actually have been thinking about this analogy that comes from the Harry Potter series. So in the Deathly Hallows, the 7th book, Harry is having these visions periodically, you know, in a dream or just a brief trance where he kind of sees things from Voldemort's perspective or from Voldemort's snake's perspective. And he'll come out of the trance and Hermione will go, Harry, you let him infiltrate your mind again. Stop it. Like, you were supposed to not do this. Because a couple books before, you know, the going theory was that Voldemort was like infiltrating Harry's mind for some external reason, and that by practicing occlumency through these lessons with the Professor Snape, that Harry could sort of resist it by kind of meditation or mental willpower. He could resist this and no longer be subject to it. Well, you know, a couple books later, he's still experiencing it. And the important thing that's revealed is like, this is not because Harry let it happen. This is not because Harry is not exercising enough willpower.
Mm-hmm.
The actual reason is because a piece of Voldemort is inside of Harry.
Mm-hmm.
And so this thing comes upon him. He can't control it. But to counteract its effects, he has to kind of rightly understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think this is really similar to a lot of the particular ways each of us experiences temptation, sin, or suffering. Is somebody might tell us, just use your willpower to stop it, or go to this kind of counseling or meditation or occlumency to magically resist it by your willpower. And the end solution you have to realize is a piece of Voldemort is inside of me. Or I'm subject to original sin. I'm going to have this body of death until Christ returns. And so the right response to that is not Hermione's response. It is actually a kind of merciful understanding of sort of the affliction of that person's nature, whether that is, you know, undesired, unchosen same-sex attraction, or, you know, a particular tendency to anger, or the experience of OCD, religious or otherwise, and beyond. But in all these issues, there's a tendency to think there's a willpower method that could get rid of it, and it's sort of your fault if you're experiencing it. But the truth is, our nature is weak, and there's a piece of, you know, sin or evil or Voldemort inside of all of us. And instead of that making us more guilty and wicked and deserving of condemnation, it means we need kind of sympathy with our nature to learn how to live with that weakness or thorn in the flesh. And I think that's like a universal thing. Not everybody realizes it. There are definitely a lot of people out there who have not realized their weakness or thorn in the flesh. But at least for me, once you've kind of detected there's something I tried to get rid of by willpower and it's not going away, it gives you a lot more sympathy for anybody else, including, say, the same-sex attracted. And so where you're like, we all have a weak nature that is doing things we didn't intend, and we didn't make it that way. We're not sinful for it being that way. But that's our plight, to deal with that and fight against it to an extent, but also to need the sympathy of others.
And to me, it appropriately brings in, well, I think about the proverb, a gentle answer turns away wrath. So you beautifully touched on just the way that, oh yeah, a lot of people are touching on this wisdom, not just Christians. This is something that other people who are taking gentle healing approaches to our humanity are saying, oh, the best way to deal with anger and wrath is not gritting your teeth, but actually requires some gentleness. And the way that we see, a lot of humanity interested in understanding our human nature and in wanting to move into a place where it's better. And what Christianity offers is not the only source of wisdom, but the man who embodies all wisdom, the Savior and Redeemer of humanity. And so we know that, and so I think that's where the biblicists were like, well, because Jesus is the wisdom, righteousness, salvation, why would we go anywhere else? And I think it's a misapproach to how Jesus relates to everything else. That he's the both the sum of all that, but he's also the creator of all that. And I think there's also, well, I'll stop there for a moment. Is there anything to add, or does that sound?
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right. Like, we see the same distinction between secular people. You've got the hustle bros who say it's just discipline, grit, just, just stick with it. And you have people who express a much more kind of gentle approach. And that's a real distinction. And Jesus was not impressed by the religious people of his day who expressed the kind of, merciless approach. He didn't say like that distinction doesn't matter. No, he said, those people are going to say, Lord, Lord, and I'm going to say, I never knew you. And likewise, Jesus's parables were not in every case explicitly religious. A lot of it is kind of about secular human life. And it could have sounded like, a secular guru offering wisdom on many issues. Like, Jesus wasn't always fronting kind of the religious dimension.
I also have seen and you alluded to this when you're talking about deeper levels of the human person, the biblicist sufficiency crowd, they tend to want to simplify everything. They want to say, like David Frank was alluding to, like, because Jesus is like this, everything else is simple. Or they say, the human being, like, we know what it's like from the Bible, so it's a very simple narration. Rather than like behavioral and social scientists, they're often complexifying. They're saying human beings, somehow there's multiple aspects of human beings, multiple structures. Like, there's more to the human life than just the thought that you produce just right now. Or like, there's more dynamics going on. Or there's more dynamics in the world than just what you see in your local area from your eyes. So I've also noticed that, and it's part of their, like, again, their epistemic package or something. Like, normally one of the threads is this simplicity narration. Like, we can just simplify everything. It's not a systems thinking structure. It's not a like multiple factors or multi-causal sort of way of thinking of the world. It's this. And then, yeah. Anyways, I don't know if I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that, but it's just something else that I've been noticing when we engage these people. So, yeah.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, and you could just ask, is that what you'd expect from Scripture? If you read Scripture, would you expect like the simplest version of human psychology would be the truest?
It's a good question.
No, it would be like the way, I forget the proverb, the ways of man's heart are really complex. Who can find it
Yeah.
out? Something like that. It's like, or there is a lot of psychology in the proverbs. Like you were just saying, like what kind of answer turns away wrath? Well, the psychologists John and Julie Gottman, who I've been studying for like marriage and conflict, like they talk about the same thing. They kind of studied people's heartbeats and found the proverbs are correct. Big surprise. But the proverb, it's not because the proverbs were so simple. It's because the proverbs had deep understanding of human nature. So yeah, I think this is where I think the Christian doctrine of sin is really getting misused. I think it gets turned into the very simple monocausal, boom, it's sin.
Yep.
That's what's causing it. Whereas, like I was saying about Augustine, I've been digging into Ulrich Zwingli's doctrine of sin. Zwingli, one of the kind of forgotten reformers. And Zwingli thought that original sin was not sin, but defect. And you could have used this in a debate about same-sex attraction, but it wasn't the issue of the time. He used it in a debate about whether babies are going to hell. And he basically said, look, yeah, they've got original sin like all of us. I'm an Augustinian, I'm reformed, but it's a defect of their nature. It hasn't led them to commit any sins. Like it would be totally unjust for God to send such a being to the fires of hell. And so if you extend that beyond, and apparently, according to Dr. Bruce Gordon, like Luther and Calvin were both not very happy with Zwingli's teaching on this. Our Westminster Confession really doesn't say Zwingli's doctrine. It kind of excludes it, but we could parse out the details.
Yeah.
But this is something, again, to dig into the theological tradition, to view original sin as more of a defect, or he said a disease. I think this leads to something like diseases. Do we think diseases are simple?
No.
No. Most Christians do not say sufficiency of scripture when it comes to disease. I mean, there's a few nowadays, but most do not. We're open to secular wisdom on such things. Well, I think the same applies to our mind. And that's the realm of psychology. I think that's also where original sin and desire and all this stuff gets going. What if it is sort of a disease or a defect of human nature, which means it's not our fault. We're all born this way.
And
we're all born imperfect.
And in the Reformed tradition, I think a lot of it would also then say, alongside original sin, the corruption piece, they also talk about original guilt and the way that that's shared in the covenant architecture as heirs of Adam and their need for a new covenant head of to be heirs of Christ and his redemption. But I'm interested in this disease motif because it, I think, appropriately brings into the conversation healing and the way that, as you talk about OCD, this treatment is a way to try to bring healing to the mind and saying, hey, the things that you fear, they actually don't need to be feared. And that has to actually be experienced and taught through your body back to your mind in order for you to experience that psychological healing and not just rationalized around, because that's where the source of the error was. And so you were talking about both this, hey, we have this thorn in the flesh, we just have to know that we're going to be this way forever. But there's also saying, well, but there is also healing available. And I'm just wondering, how do you hold that tension of seeking for healing of our corrupt natures, of saying, oh, maybe I got angry because I had this insecurity, and maybe God can actually help me heal that insecurity so that I'm less prone to anger while still recognizing the fact that we're still in this, fallen body until Christ comes.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've usually thought about it the other way, less as a tension, but because as I've thought about sin more in this way, I sort of wondered to myself, well, hold on, is this going to like affect my theology of salvation? You know, am I going to, if you have less emphasis on sin as an act that induces guilt and more on a condition that requires sympathy from others, well, it hit me, I think, reading John Mark Comer,
Oh yeah.
that healing is the idea, because he puts that in there. Now he wields it kind of against penal substitutionary atonement and kind of that side of sin, where I'd still hold that. I think that's kind of the answer to actual sin, is the guilt of our sin is borne by Christ. And so that delivers us from that side of things. But what about this nature, this body into which sin that ultimately leads to death is kind of worked? Well, there, the metaphor of healing, which is one of the kind of etymological meanings of the Greek word for salvation, like it does mean healing. Christ speaks of himself as a physician. You know, the sick are the ones who need a physician. Well, we're sick. I think that's a beautiful metaphor for salvation. But yeah, then we have to think about, okay, so are we going back to, you know, faith healing and let's all get healed? You know, there's imminentizing the eschaton there, or, you know, trying to get this healing fast or magically or through emotional manipulation. And I think we've got to think of it the way Paul thinks of it, which is not something that's really going to I don't think we get healed in this life. We survive with this mortal wound basically until it kills us. We have a thorn in the flesh. It doesn't go away until God delivers us from the body of death. So like Paul, this stuff comes from Romans 7, where Paul is really fighting with sin. And, you know, there's some interpretations where it's like, oh, this is Paul before he converted. I'm like, it better not be, because I'm going through what Paul's going through. So Romans 7, like the end of Paul's doctrine of sin there is not, let me repent really hard. Let me use extra willpower to stop all this sinning. No, it's just like, who's going to deliver me from this body of death? It's kind of this hopelessness of like, I can't really do it. I keep doing the thing I don't want to do. And what if that's an aspect of the normal Christian life? Like the fully mature, fully serious Christian life is that we're still doing the things we don't want to do. We're still bearing this disease that is going to kill us. And our ultimate healing comes with the bodily resurrection. That's our healing. That is our true salvation, is to go from being sin sick to having new bodies that are not afflicted in this way. I mean, I think if we approach other people that way, that really gives a different flavor.
Yeah.
Like we're not thinking that this thing should get fixed. We're not thinking this thing is their fault. We're approaching it more like a chronic illness. You know, when I interviewed Colton Beach, he talked about this analogy with chronic illness and like the different stages of kind of denial to acceptance to flourishing eventually, and even how they mapped on to different perspectives on Christian faith and homosexuality, like from side X over to side B at least. And I think there's really something there of, there's features about myself that, you know, wouldn't make any headlines, where I've tried to by willpower get rid of them over the last decade and a half, and it didn't work. And then there's a stage where you enter into, I think this is kind of basically going to be who I am going to be. Like I can work on it, but it's always going to take effort. You know, for example, a certain level of introversion that I experience, and I'm like, I want to love other people well, so I want to reach out beyond that. But there's limits to what you can do by your own willpower and given your nature, your personality. And so instead of guilting yourself for that, oh, I'm not going to evangelize people enough. I'm not going to talk to people and be welcoming enough at church. I'm not going to have enough friends and be, you know, bubbly enough. It's like, well, hold on. this is where the themes of like Kelly Kapic, you're only human, and some of these self-acceptance kind of start to come in of like the particular way God made you and that you're affected by the fall. This is kind of what you're stuck with. And it's good. It's also got all your thorns in the flesh built into it. And what if your sanctification isn't, fundamentally getting rid of that, but learning how to live with that, maximize its strengths, just like we use our talents to serve God, and bearing with your own weaknesses and, not beating yourself up for it, because God doesn't beat you up for it.
Yeah. Thank you for that wise word.
Yeah.
I have to say, you should start looking towards the East for some of your theologies of desire, and because you're hitting on a lot of notes
healing,
that they play already. And I think that a lot stronger than the Western tradition, especially the Presbyterians have a certain reading of the Western tradition are offering. So
yeah.
I had a couple of questions as we come to the close.
I'll just say before your question, I appreciate that being able to hold both the sympathy, healing perspective of our corrupt nature and the responsibility piece with our actual sins and transgressions. And I feel like just culturally, people tend to try to make it one or the other.
Yeah.
We either hold people responsible or we're sympathetic. And seeing the need on a very practical level, but society, discipleship, that it's both. It always like has to be both. And so I just thank you for articulating that. Go ahead, TJ.
Yeah. Okay, first question. This is an advice to listeners. So when you engage side Y people, especially straight people, do you have any advice? What has been a helpful pathway for you to talk about, maybe expand their perspectives? It could be expand their perspective, or it could be to make them be willing to hear about side B ideas. Do you have any advice on that question?
Yeah, great question. I'm definitely still interacting with lots of people who have that perspective. Yeah, even as I've shifted towards churches that are more likely to be sympathetic, there's just plenty of a range of people in any given church. And, there's even people who have lots of sympathy, but still they just come down on the side Y stuff. That makes sense to them. A couple of things that I think are helpful. I mean, this one is harder to control, but I think meeting a person is the most powerful thing that there is. There's just nothing more powerful than knowing somebody's actual story. If that's not meeting somebody, it could be a podcast, like actually hearing somebody's perspective. But I also think engaging with the side Y perspective in ways that they're comfortable with can be powerful. And that's kind of why I engage the way I do, because my mentality is the theological, the biblical, the kind of objective focus, what's really there, which a lot of people currently on the side Y think of all these identities as kind of made up. They're LGBTQ, it's all identities that are just invented, as opposed to there being something that's really there. And so I tend to engage on a couple levels. Like, you don't have to jump to the language that offends people. Like, the main thing I want to communicate to somebody can be communicated without the word sexual orientation, which I really like, but I cannot mention it. I cannot defend LGBTQ language because, as you said, really all you need to recognize is that there really are people who are same-sex attracted. Like, it's really a real difference between people. I mean, people are side Y for different reasons. Some people, if you dig into it, you're like, you think everybody's bisexual. You think everybody's kind of choosing which way to swing. And I'm like, from my experience, I can tell you that's not how it works. Like, that's not most of our experience of life. I'm sure there's some people for whom that is the experience. I actually saw, I'm not going to go there. It was basically somebody's thesis that, like, a lot of the side X stuff came from closeted gay guys being pastors. So they think just like people only marry women because of, you know, trying to follow Jesus in the first place. So it's all willpower.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the good argument is really just to, it's a real feature of people that they do not control which way they are attracted. And then, you know, you want to engage on kind of the biblical material, but at the end of the day, the Bible doesn't really give us the details on that one. So I really do think it comes down to saying, if we take in everything the Bible says, we believe everything the Bible says, and then we find out that some people really are just contrary to kind of the statistical norm across human beings, exclusively attracted to the same sex, or, you know, attracted to both sexes, but kind of uniquely. How is the Christian faith going to deal with that? Because taking the traditional interpretation of the ethic, you still see like, this is how people are supposed to behave. But what you have to realize is, wow, this is going to be a lot harder for some people. You know, for me, I found it really hard to follow the Bible's instructions, you know, not to look at a woman lustfully. But I also got to get married. And, you know, the Bible celebrates sexual expression in marriage in the Song of Solomon, elsewhere. And, you know, it's definitely correct that like marriage doesn't solve porn problems, but it's not like there's no connection or alleviation of the problem.
Yeah.
Like Paul suggests that there is, like, there's, you know, sexual desire that can be satisfied instead of all of it not being satisfied. So to me, that makes you realize like, this is going to be harder to live by the same ethic for people with a different sexuality.
Yeah.
So, and then kind of my newest tack is this, it's not like an easy tack to persuade people of like this more merciful doctrine of sin, but it is still kind of a theological thing. Like I'm saying, look, this debate has been open. It's not, I mean, the Westminster Confession does clearly distinguish between original and actual sin. Like we could really bank on that and start to say, okay, well, if you are bashing on people's sinful nature, if we want to call it that, as if it were an actual sin, like that's not correct. Original sin is something that's prior to our action. We're stuck with it. We didn't choose it. So anyway, those are a couple of the methods that I've, you know, already kind of described in the interview. But I think by operating more on the biblical and theological terrain, it can be compelling to people. Though at the same time, I think people really do need to recognize something from outside the Bible, which is some people are really same-sex attracted and they didn't choose this, and it's not going to go away.
Yeah. At least any methods we've ever tried to make it go away have not succeeded.
So far,
yeah.
Not very successful.
Okay, second question.
Though a lot of people,
go ahead.
a lot of people don't know that history. A lot of people don't know that history though either.
True.
So I try to tell them the story Greg Johnson tells without telling them that Greg Johnson was the one who told it.
That's wise, yeah. I mean, I still meet people who in their 50s, 40s sometimes, and they still remember ex-gay. Like, you know, they're straight Christians. They just remember ex-gay thing kind of existed, and they still assume that it's just how you do it, because they never engaged the question more or like learn more. They're just like, okay, a final question. And I've been asking a lot of people who've come on this question, and I'm especially curious from your particular position as sort of like a straight side B ally who's thinking a lot on some of the common conversations we've been having. How do you hope the Side B movement or the Side B project will develop in the next chapter of its existence? And that could be, what problems do you think need to be solved? That could be, what sort of goods does it pursue? It could be like, you know, it's a pretty wide ranging question, but what do you think that would be good in the next chapter?
The easiest one for me to say is I'd really like it to be articulated more on the theological level and have more of a theological defense. because, you know, as I'm trying to write something of this variety and looking for other sources, like there just isn't a lot. Like the most powerful side B stuff has been
Yeah.
memoirs.
Mhm.
Like that's the most powerful thing, or books that are kind of about ministry.
Mhm.
And then Greg Johnson did kind of some history, really, really great. Whereas some of kind of the articles, like by Denny Burke and other theologians about this concupiscence stuff, like they there's not a lot of theology that's articulating the opposite perspective. I know there's a lot of people who hold an opposite perspective, but there's not a lot of theology kind of articulating that. And, you know, at least in a place like the PCA, I think that would go a long way to helping it be more of a position that can be held and defended. But beyond that, you know, I don't think that like outreach to the more conservative folks is the only thing Side B needs to do. Like, I think by just doing things the way it's doing things, it's showing an openness to the LGBTQ community and that people don't have to hide that. I know that those very features are kind of turnoffs to the more conservative side of the SBC or the PCA or but I don't think that is something that should just be like fixed. I think probably David, you might say this too, like as the movement grows, there just are people who have different outreaches to these different sides. And I think I can see bridges being built in both directions. To kind of your future podcast interviews, I think articulating how the side position on homosexuality or sexuality in general applies over to gender identity, I think that's important and powerful. I'm happy it doesn't need to be rushed, but, you know, I think some people, like the World Magazine articles, including Carl Trueman's, that kind of bashed Revoice recently, it was all about pronouns and gender identity stuff. And I'm like, that's really obscuring, or the way they're seeing it, they're ignoring stuff where that's not the issue. But I think people knowing not exactly, here's exactly where Revoice stands and we will never make you worry again. But just like seeing that articulated more, like, and maybe you could tell me like a Wesley Hill of gender identity, like that would be really helpful. I don't know who's written a memoir kind of that variety. I've heard some of the stories and some of the Revoice's panels, very helpful. But, you know, seeing more on that, I think that would help a lot because personally, I think one of the main reasons, just to add another main reason people are side Y is because they confuse gender identity issues with sexual orientation issues. There's lots of parallels, but there's also differences. Like the main difference being, I think the sexual orientation thing is about recognizing a reality that's there. And I think that the kind of conservative or traditional position on transgenderism, the complaint is that it's saying things that are not accurate to what is true of us being either male or female in the image of God. So those are actually not exactly the same. Obviously, there's a reality of the gender dysphoria underlying that and so on and so forth. But again, additional clarity there, or there being some of these memoirs and on that side, I think would also go a long way. That'd be a hope. But my broader hope is just that kind of the controversy recedes and the stuff just like seeps back into all different churches and LGBTQ people feel less of a need to be closeted in traditional ethic affirming churches.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've thought about trying to write something in dialogue with Carl Trueman, who sees sexual identity merely in the self-expression kind of trajectory of human thinking, and then just kind of jumps to the conclusion of like, of course that's unbiblical. And to see a theologically illustrative account of the complexity of human identity. Like in James, Christians are called sinners, which seems like the biggest, like that's the root thing that we're saved from is sin, and yet we're still being called sinners.
Sinners.
And people don't seem to bring that up when they're saying you can't identify with sin. And I'm like, well, the Bible sometimes does it. But again, yeah, I think there's this whole psychological piece of like, when do you affirm someone's sonship, and adoption in Christ and the security of like, you are a saint. And when do you say, and you're a sinner, maybe a little Martin Luther on that.
My final piece on that is just I so often want to urge the word description instead of identity, because I think a lot of what people are talking about is just like, this is true of me. I'm just describing something. I'm not saying like, this is my one identity. My entire social media presence shall be about this one identity. Or people are trying to describe features of themselves, and that's accurate, and it can be accurate, and it's important for our getting through the Christian life, as I said before, to accurately describe the talents we have, the thorns in the flesh we suffer from, and then given that accurate description, to know how to proceed.
Yeah.
And to be understood and loved by others.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so
Amen.
much, Joel.
Thanks,
We so
Joel.
much appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, guys.
Is there any place where listeners can connect with you or your work if they're interested?
I would encourage you to go to my Substack, The Natural Theologian, and I'm also getting active on YouTube.
Oh, cool.
So
Okay.
Natural Theologian there, or on X. Those would be kind of my three places.
Okay, we'll also put those in our show notes, so listeners can also find them via the links.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks, listeners, for joining. Hope you had an enjoyable time. Peace be with y'all. Bye. If you want to support our work, tell a friend about it. Share an episode that you enjoyed. People who value this podcast usually find it through someone. If you'd like to help us cover costs, you can also become a supporter on Substack. While all episodes are available to current and future listeners, paid subscribers get a couple extra sign-up perks.